Hi, my name is Amanda Romero, and I am conducting a face-to-face interview with Dr. Jim Wiest. It is November 19th, 2016. It is 9:58 a.m., and we are currently in the Morrison Reeves Science Building here on the Hastings College campus. So to start off the interview, Dr. Wiest, what is your birth date and where were you born?
I was born March 9th, 1943 in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Thank you. Where did you grow up? Was it the same as Lincoln or was it different?
Yes, I grew up in Lincoln.
Lincoln, Nebraska?
Yeah.
What are your parents' names?
My mother's name's Catherine and my father's name was Harland.
Thank you. What were you doing prior to the war starting or prior to your awareness of the war?
We're talking about Vietnam.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Well, I went to college, and while I was in college, at that time, all male students were required, at least they told me I was required, to participate in ROTC. That's Reserve Officer Training Corps. And the war was in Southeast Asia was starting to heat up, and it looked as if there was going to be a major conflict over there, and I had to make a decision as to what I was going to do about that, and it was a very difficult decision. And what I mean by that is that if I stayed in ROTC all the way through for 4 years, I'd come out as an officer. And obviously, I'd be going into the military, and obviously, I'd be therefore part of the conflict. If I dropped out of ROTC, the chances were that I'd get drafted and wind up in the conflict, and as an enlisted person, and I didn't like that idea. Another option, of course, was to figure out some way out, like going to Canada. And anyway, so I opted to stay in ROTC, and I graduated and was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy.
Thank you. So where were you going to college? Where was this?
University of Nebraska.
Okay, so still in Lincoln. Thank
Yeah.
you. How else did you learn about or receive information? Was it just from the ROTC program?
I would say the vast majority of American population at that time didn't even know where Vietnam was. I certainly, to me, it was just some conflict over there in Southeast Asia. There was a great deal of concern about what was going on over there. And a lot of conflicting reports. I assume you're familiar with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. All right. Well, part of the midshipman, part of the program for ROTC is that you were a midshipman. Okay, and so I had to go on what they call active duty between semesters over the summer. And my active duty in 1964 was to San Diego, and I spent 6 weeks in San Diego on a destroyer. And at that time, I ran into this officer who spent a lot of time in the O Club. I ran into this officer at the O Club who was just beside himself because he had recently come across the secret documents concerning the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where it was very clear that there was no incident. It was staged, that the destroyers that were involved were not engaged by North Vietnamese, that someplace between the Navy reporting this incident and the President's interpreting it, decided that the North Vietnamese had in fact attacked American forces, which was an act of war and which resulted in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And it was fabricated. I mean, it was false. And so that's the kind of stuff that was going on back and forth as to what should be done. There was a dominant theory at the time that people referred to, and that was the domino theory, where the idea was that these different countries over there would start to fall one after the other, and then and Vietnam was next, and if we didn't stop the communists in Vietnam, then they would wind up all throughout Southeast Asia. And so the idea was that we had to make a stand there. At least that was the popular story, which didn't have much, again, to do with the truth or the history of the situation. So anyway, so there was a lot of that going on, charges and counter charges, and unfortunately, in the early 60s, there was no peace movement or group of people who were organized to challenge the stuff that was coming from the government and from certain news sources. So it was very difficult to get a decent idea of what was actually happening. I have no idea where the rest of the population was. I assume that they were very, very split, and okay.
Perfect, thank you. So for the record, did you have any previous military experience?
I started college in 1961 and got in the ROTC program, and I'm a boy from the middle of the country. I'd never seen an ocean before. I had no idea what a Navy ship looked like. I couldn't tell an officer from an enlisted person. And as I got into ROTC, I realized that I had really no idea what I was getting into, and so I joined the reserves, the Navy Reserve in Lincoln, and essentially I enlisted, and to get a feel for what was happening in the Navy, and so I spent 2 years doing that until somebody figured out that I couldn't do that. You couldn't be in 2 different programs at the same time. It's like being in the Air Force and the Army at the same time. It was just unheard of. So I had to get a release from being enlisted and then reaccepted back into the ROTC program. So technically, yes, I had served in the military prior to being commissioned as an officer in the Navy in 1965. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. What was your branch of service?
Navy.
Navy,
United States
yeah.
Navy. Yes.
Thank you. So what was your personal understanding of why the U.S. was involved with Vietnam?
I suppose it was a overall basic faith that the leadership in Washington knew what it was doing. That if my country was going to war, I had an obligation to support it. And as I think most young people, such as yourself, we were very morally immature. We really didn't understand the moral facts of life very well. For example, the issue of taking up a weapon and going out and killing somebody was reduced from what you're doing, actually going out and killing people, to do you have the right amount of bravery, guts, whatever you want to call it, to actually do what you're supposed to do. So if you can get young people to focus on their own personal problem, like I'm scared to death, then what they're actually doing, killing people, is off the table. They don't even consider that. And then you throw in other diversions, such as reducing morality to sexuality, like, sex is bad, you got to worry about that. Well, come on, it's not. And there are a lot bigger moral problems out there. Well, like I said, coming from that immature level of moral understanding, I wasn't able to grasp the larger picture. And I had no moral guidance. My religious people I looked up to, religious leaders, would say things like, well, a man's got to do what a man's got to do, he's supposed to go defend your country and that sort of thing. So it was a very difficult moral situation. So.
Thank you. So when and where did your training take place?
After I was commissioned in '65, after graduating, I was sent down to Pensacola, Florida for flight training. I had an interview with what they call a detailer, the guy who assigned you to where you're going to go. And he says, well, what do you want to do? And I said, oh, well, I want to be on one of those little boats, those destroyers, and out of like someplace like the East Coast, and go to the Mediterranean and hang out there. And he says, wrong answer. And I said, okay, what's the right answer? He says, well, you've already passed the flight indoctrination program stuff, and you've had the physical, and you're qualified, and you're going off to Pensacola, Florida to learn how to fly airplanes. And I said, that sounds dangerous. And he says, no problem. You can, it's a volunteer program, you can quit at any time. Well, anyway, so I said, oh, okay, and stupid me, I went on down to Pensacola, Florida, and spent about a year and a half in flight training. And you were divided into two groups of people. The pilots were those who were going to go to props and those who were going to go to jets. And I wanted to go to jets because that was that was the hottest thing going. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it big. And so I got into the jet pipeline. I got my wings, and I think it was March sometime in '67. And I talked to my detailer, and he said, okay, you did pretty well in flight school, so you have a choice of what coast you go to and what airplane you're going to fly. And so I said, well, I'm going to go to the East Coast, reasoning that's as far from Vietnam as you can get, and I want to fly the F-4, and which is the hottest thing going, And he says, you got it. So I was sent off to what's a RAG, which is a replenishment air group in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and between there and Key West, Florida, spent several months learning how to fly the F-4, which is the airplane I was going to fly in the fleet. And then I was assigned to VF-33, Fighter Squadron 33, in Virginia there at NES Oceana. And I wound up in the next squadron going to Vietnam. And so we left almost immediately on all kinds of training activities. And so, yeah. By the way, I decided to just give you an idea of what this thing looked like.
Oh, yeah, perfect.
This is a picture of an F-4J, which was
Wow.
the aircraft that I flew, and this is a picture of from the front. It's a little strange because it has some weird things hanging from the wing there. There's one fuel tank and something
Wow.
else under the wing, but it shows you the dihedral. It was very distinct about this airplane, the dihedral on the wings, which helps stabilize it, and then the negative dihedral, the anhedral on the tail section back there, which allowed that to turn very sharply. So it was a very nimble fighter.
Thank you for bringing these pictures,
Yeah.
giving me an idea.
And this is a picture of the USS America from the front.
Wow.
And these are the catapults, Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3, and Cat 4. That's what shoot off the airplanes off the deck. You'll notice the deck, the landing area is angled from the course of the ship.
Oh, yeah.
And so when you land kind of going sideways as the ship goes down there.
How long did you, or how much time did you spend on one of these things?
From the time that I checked into VF-33 till I got out in essentially 1970, I calculated one time that I spent 75% of my time while I was in that squadron on board the boat. And the rest of the time, the other 25% of the time, we were either getting ready to get on the boat, doing excessive landing practices. Carrier landings are extremely difficult to do. And so we would spend night after night after night doing practice carrier landings. And so most of the time was either spent preparing to go on the boat or getting off the boat or being on the boat.
Right.
So, yeah, the whole time, yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. Do you mind if I keep
You got it.
pictures? Thank you so much. So would you mind telling me what it was like leaving your family?
At that time, I was married. At the time I got the VF-33, I was married, and it was just part of the whole problem about going into combat. You know, you made sacrifices. You just dealt with it, and now, I was also an officer, which puts you at the Navy is highly segregated in terms of officers versus enlisted. You know, the officers are not at all as well integrated with the enlisted people as say it that happens in the Army. We're just kind of alone, and we socialize together. We live apart, and so on and so forth. So that also has the benefit of the wives that were left behind that then got together and created their own little community, and a very small community. There were, in our squadron, there were, I think, like 17 pilots and 17 radar intercept officers, the guy in the back seat. So 30-some officers in the squadron altogether.
Right.
And so that group of people, you know, became a very cohesive group. And of course, there were letters back and forth, and so there was that kind of contact. But it was just part of the problem, and again, keeping your mind off of what you're actually doing.
Right. What was the atmosphere of the society during the war?
Another problem with the insularity of this being a situation like being a naval officer is that you left society.
Right.
You were just gone. You could see it on the news maybe, but you didn't participate in it. You were in your own world. You lived on base. You lived on the boat. Oh, by the way, there are two types of ships in the Navy that people refer to as boats, aircraft carriers and submarines. They're really ships. Ships go to sea, boats stay on lakes. So, it's called a boat. Anyway, it was highly insulated, and in fact, that 1968, the year that I was in Vietnam, that's lost to me. I mean, I remember coming back, and there were personalities that I'd see on TV, and I'm like, who the hell is that? And everybody go, what do you mean you don't know who that is? Music that I'd never heard before. It was years later that I heard some of the popular music, and I go, oh, that's pretty nice. That's an awfully old song,
Right.
It came out in 1968. You're highly segregated from society in so many ways. So I really didn't know what was going on. Mm-hmm. Another thing about that society, though, back then, is that the 1950s, and I'm talking about the attitudes, the behaviors, the dress, all that didn't end in 1959. It went on through up to about 1965. So the 1950s lasted until 1965. The 60s didn't start until about 1966. And they ended sometime in the middle 70s. So, and after that, you got the 70s and stuff like that. But when we think about the cultural phenomenon of the 60s, we're talking about 1966 up through about 1975. Right. So I left the civilian world in the middle of the 1950s, and I got back in the middle of the 1960s, and it was a totally different world when I got back. So I'd spent about 5 years like on another planet.
Right. So being completely isolated from society, being on one of these boats, did you have plenty of toiletries and food?
Food, yes. This is a very stressful occupation. It's dangerous, and we were headed down into the South Pacific. It was hot, and you never got 8 hours of sleep. You could get 4 hours or 2 hours or 1 hour or 15 minutes. I could sleep anywhere. I could be briefing for a mission, and it didn't start for 15 minutes. I'd sit down and go to sleep. So you slept whenever you could. I mean, I've slept on wings of aircraft, in the cockpit with the engines running. I mean, all that. And so you slept where you could, and you ate as often and as much as you could. And so there was a lot of food available, but I could not keep my weight up. I just couldn't do it because of the heat and the stress and all that sort of thing.
Right.
So we were taken care of in that way, but the stress of the situation was so intense that your body just couldn't overcome it.
Right. Yeah. So what about the supply of the materials? Did you have plenty of bullets or?
Oh yes. we never lacked for that. The way okay, my experience was very unique. It was totally different from if you're in the Army or Air Force, or totally different experience. And we operated off the boat, and we would we left for Vietnam in straight for Vietnam in April of 1968, and got back in November, and we did. The boat went through what are called 4 line periods, LINE, where you were on line for 30 days in the Gulf of Tonkin, flying combat missions, 1, sometimes 2 a day, every day for 30 days. And then there would be about a week or a week and a half when the boat would leave the war zone and go to some port like Hong Kong or Yokosuka or Subic Bay in the Philippines, and replenish, get new stuff. And so then we'd go back out for another 30 days straight, and then back in, and so on and so forth. So yes, we had, we were well provided for.
Good, yeah. Perfect. How would the soldiers typically entertain themselves?
I'm not a soldier, I'm a sailor.
Right.
Was a sailor. Again, I was an officer. We lived in a different world from the other thousands of guys on that boat. Alcohol was strictly forbidden on board ship. However, every officer had an adequate supply of booze in their stateroom. And if the captain of the ship would have come down and knocked on my stateroom door, I would have offered him a scotch. So we drank, and when we could, of course, at that period of time in between line periods when we were pulled up in some port somewhere, we got off and we went to clubs and sometimes toured the area a little bit, but it was mostly we hung out at bars. And have you ever seen the movie Top Gun?
No, I haven't.
Tom Cruise is Maverick, Top Gun, and in Top Gun, and he's a Navy pilot, and he captures perfectly the competitiveness of that group, and the arrogance and just the attitude. He captures it perfectly, and there is one bar scene in there that I've seen 100 times. So if you want to know what Navy pilots look like on shore, then look at that. You'll see it. Of course, I mean, the pace was so intense that you really didn't have a lot of time to do anything. I mean, you were scrambling just to get enough sleep, let alone entertain yourself.
Right.
So, but on shore, then let's hit the bars.
Right. Thank you. So you did have plenty of supplies and food. How were you and the other sailors treated? Did you get proper care otherwise?
Oh, as good as it gets, You typically don't have minor injuries in aircraft accidents. You know, if you crash that aircraft, you're probably dead. So there wasn't a lot in between. We did have some guys in our squadron got injured because of some strange happenings. Like this one guy had to eject. He got shot down and he had to eject, and he got some scrapes because of the parachute harness. One guy also got shot down. Well, actually, two of them got shot down, and he landed wrong and he broke a leg. They shipped him off to someplace, probably Hawaii, to get it taken care of, so on and so forth. But most of the time, you're in a situation where you're just dead if something happens.
So how sufficient was the medical care on?
It was state of the art as far as I know. I mean, but again, that was a long time ago, and Europe. But a carrier is a group of very young people. I suppose the average age is on a carrier at any given time is someplace around 19 or 20 years old. The officers and some of the senior enlisted, they don't get much older than, almost all the officers in our squadron were like in their 20s, and the senior officers were maybe in their 30s. Anyway, and the enlisted people the vast majority of them were very, very young. And they were in very good shape. They were, if you had problems, you just didn't get in. And so you don't have a lot of medical issues other than injuries, because, you're talking about, people in their prime, physically in their prime. The medical care is quite adequate. And now, afterwards, there were some real problems with the VA, but in that particular situation, we were well taken care of.
What was the discipline like during your service period?
Absolute. There was, like I said, the naval customs are very very, very strong, and so you acted accordingly. And there was protocol on how you addressed each other, how you related to each other, and you just followed that. You didn't mess with it. I mean, even if I'm talking to a senior officer and I would like them to do something, the word I would use is, I recommend that we do this. If he wants me to do something, he would say, I suggest that you do this. And there's, everybody understood exactly what that was,
Right.
Do that.
Yeah.
It wasn't a suggestion.
Right, exactly.
So it's the Navy is very formal, very, very formal. And the enlisted guys, they treated the officers with respect. I don't know what they did behind their backs, but it was a very tight-knit group of people. And you also had to form pretty close bonds of respect with the enlisted folks. Like, I was a maintenance officer. You just don't fly the airplane. You also had very, very extensive administrative duties. And so you either were in personnel or you were in maintenance or you were in operations or something. And I was in maintenance. And my guys were in charge of the parachutes and the ejection seats and all the survival equipment. And that's other guys were in charge of keeping the engines going and things like that. So it was very important that you didn't want somebody to mispack a parachute.
Right.
It would be a deadly error. So you kept up pretty strong relationships with people, so that you worked for each other.
Right, yeah. So where all did you travel during this time?
Oh, let's see. Started off in Pensacola and then went down to Beeville, Texas. This is flight training.
Okay.
Pensacola, Beeville, Texas, Meridian, Mississippi, back to Pensacola, and then of course Virginia Beach. Lived there for 3.5 years. My family did anyway. So those were the shore base. Oh, and then Key West, Florida. Spent a lot of time down there. But the boat took us around the world. We spent a lot of time in the Caribbean. There's a Atlantic Fleet weapons range down there, and where you could use live ammunition, and so much to the displeasure of the natives. So we spent a lot of time in the Caribbean, and then Rio de Janeiro. Came around the Horn of Africa up to the Philippines, Hong Kong, Yokosuka. Some people made it to other places, but just a lot of different places. And yeah.
Where all would you get off, or I guess get on to land?
Okay. Well, Rio. And, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, the Philippines, Yokosuka, Japan. Well, in Japan, we did some touring. Some friends and I did some touring in Japan, Hong Kong. Some of the guys got over to some other places in Southeast Asia. Some guys spent some time in Australia, but I didn't go to Australia. So.
Did you actually ever step foot into Vietnam?
My boots never touched the ground in Vietnam. One circumstance, one night we had some hung ordnance on the aircraft, and it was, I think, some 500-pound bombs or something. They did not come off when they were supposed to, and so we couldn't go back on board ship with hung ordnance, because if it came off, during carrier landing, which is a very violent affair, you could do a lot of damage to the ship and the personnel. So I was diverted to Da Nang and landed there, and escorted around to a bunch of sandbags, and the Marines took the ordnance off the aircraft, gave me a little gas, and sent me on my way. So that's as close as I ever came to setting foot in Vietnam.
Right. What was your attitude like during the war?
Scared shitless.
Yeah. Tell me about your most vivid memory during the war. Many very vivid memories that
I I learned over the years that if you attach strong emotion to a situation, it's easily remembered. And so, in that there was such high emotion.
Right.
I mean, I could go on for hours, and you don't want to sit here and listen to all that. But yeah, there were some times when I was more scared than others. Yeah.
Right. That's very understandable too.
Yeah.
How did you feel when the United States withdrew its forces in 1973?
By the time I completed that tour in Vietnam, it even dawned on someone as dim as me that this was the wrong thing to be doing. It was absolute, total waste of people and materials, and it was just totally the wrong-headed thing to do. After I got out, which was essentially I got out like in December of '69, and then I went off to graduate school in 1970. And about 1970, the way I dealt with the situation was just almost total nihilism. I didn't care about anything. So it was a period of time when, it was just like, what difference does it make? And so I was relatively indifferent. I guess I was essentially glad that we finally figured out some way of getting the hell out of there. But it wasn't a cause for rejoicing or anything like that. So I guess I was reasonably numb,
Where were you when you received this information?
Oh, I was in graduate school at the University of Nebraska in the sociology department, and
Once the war was over, did life return to normal, or were some things permanently changed?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
So once the war had ended, did life return to normal?
For whom?
I guess for you and also just the society of America, like America.
The war was never over.
Right.
It just kind of petered out, and the huge divisions in the country were there, and I was caught in a crack between them, and I mean, we're still fighting Vietnam. It's we've never resolved
Right.
whatever that thing was about, and so the new normal was a very divided society, very, very divided society, and with a lot of emotion associated with it. I mean, people didn't like the other side. They hated each other, and I mean, it's popped out again in this last election. Just terrible. Destructive emotions, and I don't know if for me, being a left-wing liberal type, to me, I see Donald Trump as you know, as somebody who can just bring out the worst in everybody, But people on the other side look at me and think the same thing, So those issues are still raging, and so in that sense, the war was never over, and never. We moved from the 1950s into this other phenomenon that we're looking at today. Now, of course, I was immersed in this as an adult, and I didn't live through World War II, and the images of World War II were everybody came together and they stood shoulder to shoulder and fought off the terrible Nazis and the crazy Japanese, and I doubt if that's true either. I'm sure there was a lot of suppressed, alternative ways of thinking about World War II, that I never personally experienced, But I did experience what happened in Vietnam, so there was that, yeah.
Right. So you kind of elaborated on your positions, with respect to the aircraft and everything. What else could you, what else was your specific role as a sailor?
Well, our job was to interdict supplies coming down from the north, going to support the folks in the south. North Vietnam was separate. The country was divided into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And then there was this DMZ, or demilitarized zone, between the two. And our job was to attack supplies coming out of North Vietnam. And so all of our missions were flown over North Vietnam, of which I flew 130, and combat missions. And by combat missions, I mean, bullets whizzing past the canopy. The F-4 was designed, the airplane I flew, the F-4J, was designed as a high-altitude interceptor. And therefore, it was very, very powerful aircraft to be able to get up to the highest altitudes, to be able to shoot down enemy bombers and that sort of thing. Well, it was never used for that. It turned out to be a very rugged platform and capable of a lot of different things. So I spent almost all my missions were essentially air-to-ground missions. And we would be assigned. We'd be assigned a target. We'd go down to air intelligence, and they'd say, "Okay, it looks like there's some buildup here. This little bend in the river, and I want you guys to go in there and take a look. And by the way, there are these gun emplacements around there." And so we would take the assignment, and then figure out what to do about taking the target out, and then be launched, and we'd go and deliver rockets or bombs or whatever it was to take out the target, and then get back to the boat. And the Navy has a very unique way of dealing with its military operations. Like I was assigned a target, and it was my job to figure out how to get there, how to get back, how to deal with the target. Nobody told me, which is radically different from the way the Air Force operates and the Army operates. We are our own little units. You're captain of your own ship, if you will. Like I said, the F-4 was so versatile and so powerful that like for example, if it was a really big target with heavily defended, then that would call for what's called an alpha strike. And there'd be a whole bunch of bombers, heavy bombers and light bombers. And then we would surround that group, and we're talking maybe 15 or 20 bombers, and the F-4s would be launched, and then we would rendezvous with that group of guys, and we'd head into the target, and as air support, to hold off the MiGs, the aircraft, the enemy aircraft, and then we would come ahead and go in and look for guns, and when they started shooting at us, then we'd shoot at them to get them to hold their heads down long enough for the bombers to come in and take the target out, and then we would circle overhead to hold off the MiGs, and then go back to the boat. So very complex missions like that. So that's what we did. Most of them were, of the missions I flew were air to ground. Some of them were called combat air patrol, where you were protecting a certain area from enemy aircraft.
Right. So you had mentioned prior to the interview starting that you had gotten wounded multiple times.
Wounded?
Or
no.
Just...
Oh, multiple medals.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I must have misinterpreted that.
Right, yeah. I mean, well, we all got medals,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Never mind. Thank you
Yeah.
for clearing that up.
No, I never dinged myself. Never had a scratch on the airplane.
Okay, so you never actually got wounded. Okay. Why do you think that the United States failed to win the war?
We were on the wrong side of history. It was not America has become and has gloried in its ability to do things with force. Even though that really hasn't been the history of our country, if you look at it carefully, that's the way it's taught. That's the way people have a tendency. We think about our independence as arising out of the Revolutionary War. We settled the Civil War. We won World War I, World War II. We just put a lot of faith in our capacity to do things with violence. It just amazes me. You talk to the average American citizen and you say, well, we got a problem with blankety blank. Their immediate response is a violence response. Like, well, we ought to shoot him, or we ought to put him in jail, or we ought to, blow him up, or whatever. There are a lot of things you can't do with war. I mean, you can eventually kill most of the enemy, I suppose, but it's just like, beating your dog with the hope that it's going to love you more. Violence just doesn't work in many situations. I mean, it does in some, but in many situations, it really doesn't work. And so the idea of using war to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese was just an impossible task. I suppose we could have turned the surface of Vietnam into something that looked like the surface of the moon, killed all the people off and claimed victory. But we're talking about taking over a situation that arose out of European colonial a European colonial world, like, back, well, 50 years or so before Vietnam, or 75 years, that, the world powers like Britain and France and et cetera, they had all these colonies out there, and one of them was Vietnam. The French had Vietnam, and that was coming apart on it. The colonial model just wasn't working anymore, that we just kind of blundered in and took over from the French, and so we, so we were left with this problem of a colonial model falling apart, and our only response was, well, let's go to war and solve it. Well, it was very misdirected to think that we could have done that. We would have been so much better off if we would have just given every Vietnamese $100,000 and said, hey, what do you say we're buddies now? It would have been a lot cheaper, a lot fewer lives would have been lost. Yeah. So, I cannot even imagine a military solution working there when actually you think about it. Let's say we're able to defeat the military machine at the time. We would have had to have occupied that country, and for what? I mean, like, what are we going to get out of it? It would have cost us dearly to do something like that. And besides that, it's becoming now apparent that we had some very bad leadership at the very top for all the wrong reasons. In 1968, the year that I went to Vietnam, and of course, 5 years later, that we finally started to pull out. 1968, they were talking about the U.S. and the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese were talking about pulling out, and coming up with some sort of a peace treaty. And the peace treaty that was on the table was exactly the one that we wound up with in 1973. Richard Nixon was running for president, and he, through an intermediary, was able to convince the South Vietnamese not to participate in the peace treaty. And because they were making, the leadership in South Vietnam was highly corrupt, and they were making a lot of money off of this whole thing. And and a lot of people in the United States were making a lot of money off this whole thing. And he basically skids the peace treaty. And by the way, if documentation for that, if you want to read about it, try the President's Club.
Okay.
And it's a novel, or not a novel. It's a book about the relationships between presidents, and there's a chapter on there where Nixon and his treason was exposed. The reason that LBJ couldn't do anything about it was that he'd obtained the information about Nixon's treason with the illegal wiretaps, and he couldn't use that information. And plus, it would have been a major, I don't know, it would have delegitimized the American government to the population considerably. you know. Anyway, stuff like that was going on, you know. So it wasn't a matter of winning the war militarily. There was all these other little games that were going on, and again, we had come. You know, Hitler showed us the way in World War II. Germany in the 1930s was a mess after World War I, and he brought that country back from the brink of this terrible, terrible depression by developing a modern version of the military-industrial complex, where the political arm keeps things under control, and it takes money from the population and spends it on war making, and everybody's happy. Well, we had to adopt that model to beat the Nazis and the Japanese. So then we were stuck with it. You know, the thing that was driving our economy was the military machine, and so Eisenhower, who was no liberal, you know, he warned about the military-industrial complex taking us over, and so we got to the place where our economy was dependent upon us cranking out military goods and services, and so we became dependent upon that as a nation. And it's one of those things, you know, like, you know, give a guy a hammer and he starts looking for nails. I mean, everything is we got to do something with this military,
Right.
you know, and so you know, it's a very complex thing, but you know, war just isn't necessarily the way to solve the world's problems, and I just can't imagine how it would have solved any kind of a problem with North Vietnam, and so.
Right. So if you could describe the war in one word, I guess, what would it be? And I guess why?
Wrong.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, we got to come up with alternative means to energizing the economy that has the same kind of level of intensity that preparing for war does. We got to come up with purposes other than defeating the enemy, and we're just not there. I mean, there are all kinds of problems out there that we could, you know, turn our resources onto and get rich doing it. Everybody, but we just can't seem to just think about it. We can't even conceive of it. So.
Right.
Yeah.
How did you maintain any relationships, if any, that you made during the war?
I didn't. None. But what I did was, after I got back to graduate school in 1970, I got a call one day from somebody who says, you ever think about joining the reserves? And I said, well, there's nobody flying F-4s around here in Lincoln, Nebraska. And he says, well, I mean, the Air Force was, but that's the Air Force. He says, nah, he says, if you want to get back in and, you know, and fly again, we can go down to Memphis and you can join a squadron down there. And I said, well, how do you get down to Memphis? And he says, well, we have this airplane that leaves and goes down there and comes back. And so I said, oh, okay. So anyway, long story short, I joined the reserves, and once a month I'd jump on an airplane, go down to Memphis, and we'd fly, not F-4s, but anti-submarine warfare aircraft, P-2s and P-3s. And so I developed that set of relationships. And I wound up spending a total of 22 years in the Navy, you know, and so that was a military connection, I guess. But I never saw the people that I was in the squadron with in Vietnam ever again after I walked away from that.
Thank you. If you had the opportunity to go back in time, would there have been anything you would have done differently, knowing what you know now?
Boy, you know, that's such a difficult thing, because, you know, I am who I am today because of the experiences that I had.
Exactly.
I'd be a totally different person today from, you know, that. But knowing what I do now, I would have figured out some way of staying out of the war. I would have gone to graduate school. I would have gotten into sociology in a little different way. And I would have been an anti-war activist. I'm an applied sociologist, and when I was in graduate school, they only trained what they called pure sociologists. I mean, you worked on theory and developed pushed back the boundaries of the knowledge and the discipline and all. Well, I don't do that. I use my sociological skills to help people solve problems, organizations solve problems. You know, they have to make a decision. They need data to do it. I can gather the data for them, and I can lay it out for them so they can understand it, so they can make a decision. I'm talking about hospitals, police departments, banks, the country club, various organizations, and I probably would have, and I'm happy doing that. I'm still active as an applied sociologist, so I would have probably found some way of making that my life's work back then.
Right. So you've talked about sociology and attending grad school. What did you go on to do as a career after the war had ended?
Well, I did my time in graduate school. I ran into a guy from, this is Lincoln, Nebraska, and I don't know how familiar you are with Nebraska, but it's, the various areas of Nebraska are very provincial. People in Omaha have nothing to do with people in Lincoln. People in Lincoln have nothing to do with anybody out west of Lincoln. They're just totally uninterested in anything that happens anyplace else. And so I was born and raised in Lincoln, and came back for graduate school, and I ran into this guy who was the chair of the sociology department at Hastings College, and he was back in school doing something, and he was taking some graduate courses, and then he was going to go off and do something else, and he says, "Hey, I'm going to be gone for a year. Would you come in and fill in for me at Hastings College?" And I said, "Oh, well, I look for a real job. Yeah, I'll go do that." But where's Hastings College? You know, I mean, I didn't have any idea, and so I came out here, and I was ABD at the time. That's all but dissertation is what that means. All I had to do was finish my dissertation, and I got my PhD. And So I came out here in '77 and started teaching, and I was stunned. I'd never been in a situation where real education went on before. You know, certainly not at the university, but you know, here we had, you know, small classes. You could do whatever you wanted as long as you were productive. You had support from everybody. Different disciplines got together and shared ideas. I just never had experienced that academic environment before. So at the end of toward the end of the academic year, Tom Lane was his name, calls up and said, "Hey, I just got hired as chair of the sociology department at, I think it was Idaho State or something like that. So I'm not coming back." And I said, "I'll stay." And so they let me stay, and I was there for 35 years. So.
Thank you so much. Have your views on the war changed over time?
I suppose they've gotten a little more sophisticated. But like I said, when I was at the front end of this thing, just, you know, signing up, it was a tough one. I just really didn't know, and I didn't have any help making that decision. It was like a 50-50 kind of decision. The war didn't seem right, but on the other hand, it was my country, you know, and all that, and all these apples and oranges I'm trying to, you know, compare. And so I wasn't that enthusiastic about the war in the first place, and I certainly didn't want to go participate in it because that was just damn dangerous. And particularly the kind of stuff I was doing. You know, a lot of people got killed doing that. And so I wasn't real enthusiastic about it in the first place, and of course now I'm you know, dead set against it. But yeah. But certainly, once I left the Navy, it was a bad situation, and I knew it at the time. So.
Right. Did your involvement with the military change your thinking about war or about military in general?
Well, I knew absolutely nothing about the military before I went in. And I learned a lot about it. And I suppose one of the major misconceptions that most civilians have about war and the military is somehow they think the military has something to do with war, causing war, ending wars or whatever. And it's not that way. The military is stuck with the job, but they didn't cause the war. You know, they didn't elect to do it. The political system did. And to attack the military because you're unhappy with the war situation is wrong-headed. You know, if you're unhappy with the international situation, do something about the politics. You know, but don't attack the military. And the people in the military are some of the most upright, you know, caring people I've ever run into in my life. You know, it's they're caught in this situation, and So I guess there's that about that I learned about the military. It's it knows how to do what it does, and that's very impressive. You have people who are just organizational geniuses, that are running the outfit. They know how to get things done. The average civilian out there has a hard time running a meeting, let alone getting something done. And people in the military know how to get things done. Mm-hmm. And so I give them that.
Great.
All right.
Thank you. Yeah. So my last question for you today would be, what lessons did you learn that you would want others to remember about this time in history?
Well, we got to get away from this military-industrial complex model, economic model. We cannot solve problems, whether we're talking about radical Islam or homegrown terrorism or whatever. We can't solve that with the military. There are much better ways of doing it. But we seem to be just that just seems to be our own solution, is to fix everything. It's like send in the military to solve it for us, and I think we found that just causes more problems than it's worth. Of course, to repulse an attack, you got to have an attack of force. You got to have the military, but that's not the way we're using it. So alternative means of solving problems other than violence. We need to start working on that big time. We got to come up with some other economic engine other than the military to keep the country going. And it's not like we don't have a ton of other options out there, just that we just won't commit to it. And for good grief, I believe solving the energy crisis. We can put just a tiny bit of the money we're dumping into the military toward that, and we'd be a lot better off. I do not think that humans are inherently violent or that they're inherently prone to war. I think it's completely a social. They're capable of violence, but it's not something that we're stuck with. We could do something about it. There are alternative social solutions out there, and so I'd like to pursue that.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wiest, for taking the time and sharing your experiences with me. I greatly appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.